We've all seen stained glass windows in churches and halls around Australia, but have you ever thought what they're for and who they're for? This is a film about stained glass and how it has been used to commemorate those who served in 5 separate wars in 3 separate centuries. In Australia, one of the most recent is the Mother's Window at St Augustine's Anglican Church in Hamilton, Queensland. It commemorates the awarding of a posthumous Victoria Cross to Corporal Cameron Baird, 2nd Commando Regiment. Kay and Doug Baird are determined to keep their son's name and his sacrifice alive.
We acknowledge what Cameron did. He gave his life for his country, for his unit, for his fellow soldier. And I think that's why that he was loved and respected so much, not only by his team, but the general public.
Architectural glass artist Christopher John was chosen to develop a stained glass window as a memorial to Cameron Baird's war service. The design of the window was constrained by the historical and architectural context within the church.
But I guess the most important thing is the context of these windows. In 1919, when the church was built, directly after the First World War, it was dedicated as a war memorial church. So now, almost 100 years later, there's 100 stained glass windows in that church, all dedicated to different aspects of the war and, the armed services. What was said was that all the architectural ornamentation, this base and the canopy, sometimes called tabernacling, that had to be the same, so it fitted in the adjacent window. The colour scheme had to be similar and the sizing of the figures had to be similar. So what I've done is I've used this very Victorian way of treating landscape and plants, but looking at photos I'd seen from the First World War that there was a lot of ladders, climbing in and out of trenches. They used ladders, and there were the duck walks across the muddy terrain. So I've got this very angular and sort of aggressive backdrop, but then I've used a very sort of soft and gentle lyrical posing of the figures. After having to kind of follow suit with the other windows, the base of the window was left, so I used a military shield, and this was where the committee really kind of rose to the occasion. They were terrific because I had many different solutions for this, but someone had said, "Why? I've got a newspaper clipping. Quentin Bryce, the Governor-General, she has just awarded the 100th Victoria Cross to the mother of a fallen soldier." So the image from the front of the newspaper was a female hand reaching out and placing a Victoria Cross into another female hand.
In 2015, the Mother's Window was unveiled at St Augustine's Anglican Church, Hamilton, Queensland. 2 hands, one handing the VC to another. Former Australian Governor-General Dame Quentin Bryce has come to meet Kay and Doug at the church.
Dame Quentin, when she handed over the Victoria Cross to us, that was a real special moment, and that was her hand on top of my hand, explaining just what it all meant. And it was like from one mother to another mother.
There's so much touches my heart about them. I think the hands particularly are symbolic of the bonds that women share. I think to have this beautiful art here, really, I mean, it's art and beauty and a very powerful symbolism that we see. It will provoke storytelling that will inspire generations, will be told again and again and again, and it will always be there, I'm sure.
Bronwyn Hughes is an art historian and an expert on commemorative stained glass in Australia.
We all associate stained glass with scenes from the Bible and images of saints. But in fact, stained glass has been used to memorialise wars in Europe and Britain from the Middle Ages, often depicting people who were defenders of the faith. It was not until the 19th century that ordinary, everyday people were named on windows. This was a tradition that was brought by the colonisers when they came to Australia. The first commemorations in stained glass in Australia were during the Boer War. Before that, we were not involved in international conflicts to a great enough extent to be able to commemorate men who died. In fact, very few did. Images that were used for the Boer War were similar to this one behind me here, the Charlton window, but sometimes they also depicted the saints. So we have windows to St Michael and St George, particularly the two saints most associated with war, warriors themselves, and therefore could be commandeered for the cause of stained glass and still be acceptable into the church. Windows of the Boer War was the first time that we saw portraits in stained glass. The young men who'd gone away to war not to return, and therefore their families had this opportunity to put their memory of their son or their father or their brother into an image that they could use as a form of headstone in the absence of a grave.
The Charlton window, which Bronwyn Hughes just mentioned, was originally installed in Euroa, central Victoria, in 1903. This photo is from when it was installed. It commemorates the service and sacrifice of Private John Charlton in the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902. The window features a helmet of salvation superimposed over a sword of sacrifice and a shield. These emblems and the inscription below convey community beliefs in service to God and in a just cause, a cause that led Australians to fight during the Second Boer War and later the First World War. There's also a story behind this window. It was installed in 1903, but then it was dismantled and stored and completely forgotten until the 1980s. It's been painstakingly restored by Bruce Hutton and Phil Davis of Armand Glassworks. In November 2016, it was donated to the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. After installation in the lower level, the window was officially launched by the Governor of Victoria, Linda Dessau, on the 8th of June 2017.
It's an honour for me to be able to officially acknowledge the exhibiting of the John Charlton Memorial Window, and I look forward to viewing its rich but not gaudy beauty in a few moments' time. Thank you.
This window has become much more than a memorial to one man. It isn't even a memorial to all those in central Victoria who died during the conflict of the Boer War, but has come to represent all Victorians who died in South Africa.
Back at Christopher John's studio, he's showing photos of the live models he used for the Hamilton windows. He also uses photographs, and they've been used from the beginning in Australia, especially portraits of the dead. Here's Nathaniel Horsfall as St Nathaniel in the Anglican Church of the Good Shepherd, Bowden, Adelaide. Keith Kinnaird McKellar in St James's Anglican Church, Sydney, has become St George. Bart Zeno is a historian who's made a study of the emotional impact of war and how war has been commemorated.
Well, First World War was an industrialised war on a scale that was unprecedented, and in comparison to something like the Boer War, the death rate was something like 100 times what Australians had experienced. So where they had 600 deaths in the Boer War, in the First World War, we're looking at 60,000 deaths and 150,000 people wounded. The scale of loss in the First World War left an enormous hole in the Australian community, and it required explaining, and the way Australians explained it to themselves was through the creation of memorials, and those memorials spoke to what they thought they had fought for and what the sacrifice of their people had meant.
Dear Harold, I have just had a feast of roast pork, during which I thought of those we've had in Melbourne. I am just about to return to France after 12 days' leave in England. It is a rotten idea going back to the mud and cold in France. You couldn't have the least idea of what the mud is. I hope I may be able to tell you someday. For the present, love to all from your brotherly Ray. Lance Corporal Raymond Temby, Australian Imperial Force, December 15th, 1916.
There are an extraordinary array of memorial types in Australia that are created after the First World War. There are obelisks and soldier statues that stand in public spaces, in town squares and so forth. There are honour boards tucked away in all sorts of buildings. And of course there are stained glass windows in buildings all around the country.
This is Raucan, a small Aboriginal community on the shores of Lake Alexandrina in South Australia. It was the home of Indigenous inventor David Yinarpon, but the community was significant in other respects. The church here may be small, but its appearance on the $50 note is significant, as it contains the only stained glass window commissioned by Indigenous Australians to commemorate their soldiers in World War I.
Raucan means traditional meeting place, or ancient meeting place. And it was a place where if you were part of the Ngarrindjeri nation, whether you were a Ramangiri person from over on the Fleurieu and the other side of the country, or whether you were a Tangani person from the Coorong, or a Yarralli person going up the mighty Murray River, you'd all come by water and meet right here. It was really central. And it was for the meeting of the nation of Ngarrindjeri people. And Ngarrindjeri just means people belong to people. So they had a system of how they cared for each other, looked after each other, but where they were interdependent as well.
The window was put in after the First World War in order to honour the men from all the district, but particularly from Raucan. The 4 in the window are from Raucan, and they died in the service of their country. It took a long time to raise the money for this little enterprise. Presumably the community just raised it as they could, and so in 1925 the first window went in place here. Now this is a replacement because the place went to rack and ruin in the 1970s, and so it wasn't until the 1980s that we get the replacement window go in along the same lines as the first one, with the same intention to honour the men who fought and died in the First World War. It just makes this unique and so worthy of preservation and so marvellous that it was sought to be by the community so important that it was rebuilt.
Well, Rufus and Cyril are my grandmother's brothers, so they're my great uncles, or we'd say Orpa, in our language. But Uncle Rufus and Uncle Cyril, young men. Uncle Rufus only really 17 when he went, told a little bit of a fib. Look, sometimes, you think, what could have been, but all of these men, all of the men that we look at on that plaque over there, they all served overseas, and then you had the rest of the men serving domestically. So it was a whole community effort, but I don't think many people would understand that communities of people who did this all around this country.
The symbolism within the window is pretty clear. We have the British flag on one side and the Australian flag on the other side. And the two of them are united by these ribbons right through. And then in the centre, we have honour the dead, faithful unto death. The Australian Rising Sun badge became popular. Then the laurel wreath around each of those texts signified heroic action. And for all those men who died, it was a huge heroic sacrifice. I just love the window. It's so beautifully elegant and eloquent in the way that it tells the story.
Indigenous Australians were formerly restricted from enlistment in the First World War. The rule was that you had to be substantially of European origin. This didn't prevent Indigenous people from enlisting. In fact, the current estimate is that something over 1,000 Aboriginal Australians enlisted for service in the First World War. They served very bravely, and some with great distinction.
World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But 20 years later, the world was at war again, and Australia was sending men and women to Europe, the Middle East and Asia. The stained glass windows at St Bridget's Church, Mordialloc in Victoria commemorate action nearer to home, in New Guinea, and also show that modernism was influencing new styles in stained glass.
This window marks an important change in stained glass after the Second World War. It's particularly windows that uses modernism as its basis, obviously to fit with the interior of the church, and the architect was quite deliberate in choosing Alan Sumner as his artist to do this work, and it was so important from the point of view of commemoration. Alan had already worked out when he did a window at Frankston that he could come in with a reasonable budget by using really good quality glass for the main areas of the window, the ones he wanted to accentuate, but then around the edges he could use commercial glass. He could give the parish, and particularly Father English, who was so crucial to this window, and to the Battalion Association, exactly what he felt it needed to tell the story. Father English was one of several padres that served with the 58th, 59th. He was by far the most loved and flamboyant, in a wonderful way, of the men that served as chaplains to that group. Father English would often be found travelling by himself in areas where the Japanese were running patrols. It'd be quicker for him to do that than to take the 3.5-hour journey to go and see some company that he maybe hadn't seen for nearly a week, and he didn't like that. He liked to go and see his men whenever he possibly could, and to do that he took the shortest path. Hallmarks of modernism in stained glass refer very much to getting rid of that 19th century tabernacling, the architectural work that used to cover around the windows. Here we have none of that. It's very pared back. There's a fair bit of realism here. There was often abstraction, and there is some abstraction as well, but it was at a time when people could accept the abstraction for what it was and see the figures that they would recognise very much as those Second World War figures. Older windows that used the digger were much more like saints standing up within their frame. But by the time the 1950s comes along and this window is commissioned for this church, we've accepted the digger in his jungle greens. We've accepted that you can put guns in the shot. Here they're great big 25-pounders probably, that were hauled over these mountains in New Guinea by these men, in bits admittedly, but to be able to react to the Japanese invasion was a very different way of looking at stained glass, telling a narrative much more than just the symbolism of one figure or one saint. The role of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, as they were called, was crucial for both supply of food and equipment and getting the stretchered wounded out, and also the supplies back in to those that were left to carry on. Alan Sumner has used those realistic elements of the supplies coming in by parachute, the men being stretchered out by the native bearers, the men climbing those mountains, particularly Double Mountain, which was one of the ones that really stood out for the men as their baptism of fire.
The response to war in 1939 from Australians was much more sombre than it had been in the previous war. They knew what to expect and they knew what the costs might be. They were committed to this war. They believed fighting the Nazis and defending the British Empire were good aims. The war changed radically with the advent of war against Japan, and this caused Australians to be deeply affected in all aspects of their lives. And this kind of war demanded new expectations from people for a better society afterwards, and that involved things like government being involved in the provision of welfare, housing security, employment and unemployment benefits, and healthcare into the future. And this is really the reward that people expect for their participation in this kind of war. Australia's a changing place after World War II. One of the key catalysts for that change is the mass immigration program, which brings people from all parts of Europe to Australia. They bring new culture, new ideas, and we also have the baby boom that is producing a younger population in Australia. Australians find themselves involved still in a rolling set of conflicts in the region, whether that's in Korea, in Malaya, or in Vietnam.
The war caused deep divisions in society, and many returning servicemen were shunned. It made commemorating the war and those who served a very difficult task.
By the time we're commemorating the Vietnam War, stained glass is totally out of fashion. But the development of new technologies and techniques in glass makes it more adaptable to different environments, including outdoor ones.
It's August the 18th, 2023, and Vietnam veterans have gathered in Seymour, Central Victoria, to mark the 50th anniversary of the end of Australia's involvement in the war. This is also the site of the Vietnam Commemorative Walk. In 106 glass panels, it commemorates the more than 60,000 Australian men and women who valiantly served in the Vietnam War. The service was attended by Army personnel and Vietnam veterans. And, most importantly, representatives from 3 local schools: Seymour College, St Mary's College and Puckapunyal Primary School.
Good morning, locals, schools and others who are gathered here today. Thank you to the brave men and women, living and deceased, who served our country during the difficult days of the Vietnam War.
Following the official ceremony, the students walked with the veterans and with serving soldiers to place poppies and wreaths beneath the glass panels of the memorial wall.
Jan McCarthy on behalf of the nurses.
That's Jan McCarthy, one of the nurses who gave dedicated service in the operating theatres of Vietnam and who has campaigned for the role of nurses to be recognised in memorials such as this one. In the light of the massive social changes since World War II, traditional forms of commemorating the war dead have seen a major rethink. Far fewer people attend church services, and for many they are no longer the centre of a community. But people need to remember and to honour those who served. Finn Murphy was part of the team who designed the Vietnam commemorative walk.
When the project was announced by the Mitchell Shire, it was for a black granite wall with 60,000 engraved names in it. I've got 2 young daughters, and I said, you know, if you want me to be a person that brings up my family, to be shared the story that you want to tell, we're going to have to do something, firstly, a lot better than a black granite wall with a list of names, because that, you know, we won't come, my children won't be engaged. At the time, we'd been working in glass, and particularly looking at artwork in glass and narratives, using glass as a medium for sharing those stories. There's no limit in terms of the visual content we can include in a glass panel. You know, the limitation is our imagination. The vets group had been collecting about, I think it was about 4,500 photographs from men on tour from both Australia and New Zealand, and they had this huge visual resource. And then when we suggested we could use this imagery to tell a story, it just opened the world up to what this war could be. And I think that challenged the committee in a lot of ways, because, you know, how do you tell the story? It is a contentious part of our history. How do you tell the right story? And how do you bring everyone along the journey and not be biased in one particular position? In the wall itself, there's 106 panels, and then there's 2 end panels, so that's 108. Then there's a commemorative panel for those who died, the Killed in Action panel. And then on the western side of the wall, we have another 4 for the VC recipients, the Victoria Cross Awards. What we see today and the story that's told in the glass panels is really a tribute to the involvement of the Vietnam vets through the committee that was put together to work on the project.
The Vietnam War, the most divisive in Australia's history, continues to hold a fascination for generations that were not born when it happened. At St Patrick's Primary School, Kilmore, teacher Shelley McCalkey started a project in 2021 to explore the war with her students.
Meeting the people involved in the Vietnam War, it was very interesting. Just hearing their stories from their years of service changed my perspectives I had on war, and that it had a very much a profound impact on their lives, because it's not so much during the war, it's also after the war. It's sometimes very sad. Other times it's very rewarding that people do find happiness after Vietnam, and that they have chosen to speak to us about their experiences.
Oscar and his fellow students interviewed 26 Vietnam veterans. They learned how to edit the interviews and were also taught by professional stills photographers how to take high-quality photographs of the veterans. Their work is showcased in this corridor at the school. Their recorded interviews can be accessed using a phone app triggered by a QR code on this memorial plaque. Vietnam veteran Dennis Craik came to the school so Oscar could show him the recording of his interview using Dennis's phone.
So Oscar, I'd like you to meet Dennis.
Hi, good to meet you, Dennis.
Good to meet you too, Oscar.
It might be very different from the stained glass of Victorian windows, but when Dennis sees his story glowing from a glass screen on his mobile phone, it's another form of illumination and commemoration that keeps the bravery of those that served and the sacrifice of those that never returned alive. The fact that so many young people are interested in Australia's wartime history, and especially in those who served, is deeply meaningful to Dennis Craik and other veterans. In the 125 years since the Second Boer War began, the techniques and designs of glass monuments has changed in so many ways. But one thing that remains a constant is the importance of glass. which, through its transparency and inherent beauty, lets the light shine forever.